So there's a, it looks to me as though the impact of this particular event is going to be a little bit more long-lasting than perhaps other events. Like, you know, the whole 9/11 thing had very specific impacts as it relates to Homeland Security and the wonderful world of TSA and getting through airports and stuff. The 2008 financial crisis got the banks at least to start behaving moderately responsibly, although you have to argue whether that's really worked out. But this is very different in the sense that it has had a very, very sudden impact on people's lives, and has sent political institutions into chaos, quite frankly, and business into chaos, and people into shock.
And 1.5 billion children of the world out of classroom. I think that's kind of a shocking number. I mean, maybe previous to this, if we look at all the countries of the world, there might have been 250,000 children that really were not attending school, that maybe should have been attending school. But at this point, we're at 1.5 billion. So that's quite a shocking number, I think. Yeah,
and you know, there are a few people who are now starting to sort of talk about, you know, what does this mean for the world of tomorrow? And I mean, those are enormous questions that I wouldn't even dream to start trying to answer. But I do think it has impacts on the business of work. We've talked a lot over the years about the future of work. A guy called Jason Aberbrook the other day was talking about the now of work, in the sense that whatever the future was, excuse me guys, it's just disappeared, it's now. And we have to completely rethink what we're doing in terms of people. Forget process and technology, that will take care of itself anyway, we've known that for years, yeah? But in terms of people, what are we going to do with people? How are we going to look after people? Because we haven't done a very good job of that, in my view. I mean, when I said to him the other day, I said, you know, my time in America, there were a few things that I learned, and one of them was that Americans seem to me, at least, to be very, very poor on intimacy. They don't like to reveal much about themselves, and they certainly don't trust people in the way that we do in Spain and France, where I used to live, right? They don't have the social connections that we used to have in Spain and France, and which in some senses has accounted for what's happened in Spain and Italy, in the sense that older people sit around. I mean, just sit around and shoot the shit and drink wine, and that's it. You know, that's what you do. And, you know, that physical proximity has probably been a significant contributing factor. Not something that would operate in the same way in the US. Now, I mean, I can draw similar parallels in the UK. I mean, we're famous for this stiff upper lip thing, right? But I saw that as being a very specific characteristic in trying to form relationships with many people over in the US, which were quite unsuccessful most of the time, to be honest. And it seems to me that in having listened to what's being said, that may not be true. That in fact, people do crave intimacy. They do crave wanting to feel as though they matter and valued and all the rest of it. But that the way in which business has set up employment, self-employment, however it manifests itself, is such that they've not been able to have those things come forward. And maybe this thing changes that, because employers realize that it isn't really a great idea to have a pissed off, unhealthy, frightened workforce, because they aren't going to get much out of them, right? That's only for starters, of course. And by the way, if I behave badly and you end up dead, that's probably even worse. Do you see where I'm going with this, right? And I wonder whether this is some kind of a tipping point that will get business generally to rethink this and reframe how we deal with people in a fundamental way. What is, I mean, you talk a lot to people, Marilyn, what do you think?
So it's interesting because I was
Excuse me,
also,
excuse my speech, by the way. It was a speech.
and I haven't prepared one. I actually was thinking
That's
about,
fine.
including your experience into the way I'm viewing this in terms of internationalism. So I too have been someone who's lived abroad, lived in other cultures. I considered myself, and I know this is computer terminology, but stateless at one point in my career. And that's not entirely true, right? You're shaking your head. Statelessness for me meant that I had affinity for whatever place I was in. So it comes down to that empathy thing. And it's interesting too, you know, perhaps you and I aren't old enough to have lived through another pandemic, but we certainly might have had people who knew of people who did. I'm thinking of you know, grandfather and father generations. But what I wanted to say about this internationalism, and it's interesting that you talked about qualities of behavior and response in a community sense. My background, if you might recall, is that I lived in a community in the Middle East for a good portion of my adult life, actually.
You're a kibbutznik, right?
Yeah, for at least over a decade. And during that period of time, the experience, and that's something that I can draw on or liken this situation to a little bit, was that during the Gulf War, the country had to quickly educate its citizens to understand that they would need, that the front would be their home, and they'd need a safe room and a gas mask, which is kind of shocking. I mean, it's a little different than this, because, but maybe, you know, same, but different. We at least had the advanced warning of seeing this happen in another part of the world, and maybe had a brief opportunity. And I think my messages, are you hearing them? I hope that's not disturbing our flow.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, so so the idea of having experienced a situation where we're suddenly thrust into a response, and that response includes not only our work and our professional life, but our families as well. So
right.
Again, sitting in a safe room with chemical warfare, fear in the background, having to deal with your work, which has suddenly been entirely disrupted, your children who are out of school. That's not an unfamiliar, unfortunately, situation for me. So that was back in the 90s. And I'm thinking about how people respond and how people cope and how people deal. And as I said, same, but different. I mean, we had a little bit of advanced warning, seeing what's happening in Wuhan and South Korea and other places in the world. So the question is how fast we mobilize and how quickly we draw on our ingenuity and creativity and resources to solve our immediate problems. And I think that I'm actually pretty optimistic that this is not just incredibly challenging, but also an opportunity. And when you talked about the future of work, and I think about the future of learning, I think there might be an opportunity, because I see parallels in both of these places. I have a number of family members far flung in the world. I have children and school-age grandchildren in Greece, in various parts of the U.S. I have a child in Canada, and so I'm getting an opportunity to listen to them, to hear their experiences. That's at the family level, and a professional level. Just as this was beginning and ramping up in the United States, I happen to have been in a design thinking workshop with graduate students in Georgia. And I continue to engage with them a little bit and see how they're managing to learn and conduct their studies in a rather new format. And what I'm seeing is that there's a bit of a problem or adjustment for those people providing services, whether they are business leaders who are managing their workforce or professors who are dealing with a new way of teaching their students in the university, or school children and their peers and teachers. The idea of command and control, it has entirely changed. And I'm speaking to teachers too in my New Jersey community. I have a friend who's a biology teacher in middle school. She's a wonderful, wonderful instructor. She's a marvelous communicator. And what she loves is the proximity to her students. And she's totally overwhelmed. She absolutely doesn't want to teach in this kind of, technology-based, remote, digital framework. And I'm listening to her, and I'm trying to understand how she can feel proximate to those students when she is physically removed from them. And I think that all of us are facing this new reality. And I don't think it's I don't think it's much different in the Middle East or in the US or in Europe in that sense. You said something about your stiff upper lip, and I recalled that years ago you and I did some kind of engagement where we spoke about community building and the idea of ghost mapping and cholera, and that London story, I don't know if you recall, for epidemiology as being having good outcomes of changing the paradigm so that the experts really were the locals and not necessarily the scientists who thought that cholera was airborne, actually, and not, as it turned out, to be waterborne. So this concept of having proximate knowledge, even if you aren't physically able to be in the same room with your students or your workers, or inversely, starting bottom up, having that walk the neighborhood type of expertise is I think very, there's a lot of optimism in that. I don't think one person can solve these huge problems alone. I think the idea of community coming together to do that is inspiring. I don't know if you read, I saw this last night. There's a new movement in Canada called caremongering. It's the opposite of fear-mongering. And it's the idea that community comes together, provides resources to itself in terms of tools, in terms of addresses, in terms of available resources. And it's a movement to combat the scaremongering that, unfortunately inundates us. Another thing that I saw that was very, filled me with optimism was a few minutes before this call, Julien Devat, who now works for Google, posted about Google's learning platform, which is trying to provide a platform for learners to learn more about distance education, to educate themselves. I think the scary thing is that for many people is that, they feel that they have to have the tools and the environment to solve problems now. And I think all of us could take a moment, take a deep breath and realize that, we're doing triage. We have to figure out a way to function that makes sense for us. A lot of the instructors are pushing back on the digital tools. They're overwhelmed. So finding the ways that work best.
Before we go on, Marilyn, I have to show you this because I don't know if you heard my phone beep. See that?
That is the birth of a child.
That's my latest grandson.
Congratulations.
Literally just arrived.
Oh my goodness, and good timing. I think before, well, yes, and see, that's the optimistic part of me. difficult in this time. You know, that again, I gave birth in a gas mask during a Scud attack, so I know what
Really?
that feels like.
Really?
Yeah, to my fourth child, yes.
Now that's something I bet many people didn't know, and they're going to find out about this fairly shortly. That's a pretty unique situation there. I love it. Absolutely love it. A Scud attack. Excuse me while I give birth. Just bomb somewhere else, will you? Oh my goodness. Just back to this. Why are they resistant? Is it because they've suddenly become overwhelmed? They've not been prepared?
Yeah, this is something that was thrust upon them. This isn't something that they were perfectly prepared for. I mean, a lot of organizations, schools as well, have a lot of these tools. I've been doing a kind of survey of the various tools that are out there, looking at them, trying to see if there's things that are simple and well defined. And I noticed that some of the school systems actually have IT support that immediately jumped in and made these things available to instructors that were perhaps less used to working with them. And what I hear is, I don't want to learn another tool now. I'm overwhelmed. There's so much flying at me. You tell me that I need to do these things asynchronously. I'm not, really certain what that means. I'm not comfortable with video content. I'm not comfortable with this way of giving assignments. I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm actually even seeing students with that kind of pushback. Hey, let's just do a synchronous meetup. I know I'm going to have to polish and rehearse material that I'm recording. This is from adult students. And from the kids, I'm hearing, this is boring, the way our teachers are handling this. How can I'd like to be able to partner more with other people. There's a loneliness for the students in that non-proximate way of learning. But I think the general theme is overwhelm. Too many bells and whistles. I heard that yesterday from a professor. Don't want those bells and whistles right now. I just want to be able to deliver the knowledge and have the connection with the students. And here I see opportunity, because I think it was maybe back in the 70s with Malcolm Knowles and his adult learning theories, who spoke about this idea of having a guide on the side rather than a sage on stage. And that's why I relate it back to the enterprise as well, too. People aren't really that familiar with this idea. They know command and control. They know how to, they believe they know how to orchestrate or organize a certain type of organizational structure, but suddenly it's changed. And this idea of no longer being the sage on stage, but the guide on the side is it's threatening too, in a little bit of way. I'm used to working as an individual. Said one British, she's in America, but one British middle school instructor that I spoke with. So it isn't just an American versus European or Asian or Middle Eastern problem, I think.
It's interesting. I spoke with BJ last week, I think and he's very concerned about what happens for the generation of folk in his business. How are they going to come forward, right? How are they going to be mentored? How are they going to learn? Because the notion of apprenticeship has kind of disappeared, and you kind of learn on the job and all that sort of stuff and all the problems that go with it. I would imagine that the problems that you're describing are simply going to be reflected in those environments very rapidly, aren't they? I would imagine so.
Absolutely. And in doing some thinking, and I would prefer not to do this thinking alone, and I'm testing out some of this thinking real time with people in the classroom. I recall first experiments with using WebEx, and now Zoom has it, and other formats have it as well, breakout rooms. And the idea of being able to change the context of a classroom. Again, it's a lot of focus on the technology, but if we remove and become, tech neutral in this, and remove the technologies from the equation for a moment, I think what was most helpful in guiding the presenter or the instructor or the person disseminating information that might not necessarily have been comfortable with those formats was having some kind of a producer on the side. You might have participated in some of those mentor calls where there was somebody, me, for example, who was engaging with the participants in a chat session while a presentation was going on, was making sure that everybody was comfortable in the room, that everybody's questions were being answered. I mean, this is very common for some formats, that we have such a person supporting the person that's presenting. And I started thinking about this role, and I, for lack of a better name, I was calling it a class monitor or a care monitor or a producer, somebody who assists the main presenter or the main disseminator of information. The problem is, of course, how do you scale that? How does each teacher have such a resource? How do we combine resources to give that kind of support? And I actually, again, started thinking about that grassroots wise. So in every organization or system that I've worked in, there are always those people, it could be even students, that have an affinity for technology, that have a high emotional intelligence, have an affinity for people, and are able to give that kind of resource or support to the people that they're working with. How to scale that? Not entirely certain, but maybe it has to be a grassroots, bottom-up type of thing.
Are we ready for that?
Scale aside, did you say, or scale?
Yeah. Scale aside. Let's assume that we can, in some way or other, scale what you're envisaging. Do you think that that we are ready for that kind of thing?
I think it's an opportunity for the empaths. I think it's an opportunity for the caregivers if we're willing to recognize them. I think that nobody designated me the, assistant in these presentations or welcomer or greeter at the door, right? And so these are the type of roles that people fill because of their natural proclivities. I don't know if it's something that needs to be defined, but there has to be a willingness on the other side to accept that kind of help. And I think that desperation sometimes gives birth to that, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
I think employers are going to have to recognize that people that they have in their organizations that have that kind of emotional intelligence are suddenly valuable assets. And I think they won't be able to help but recognize that they need that kind of caremongering and care monitoring and help.
So what about the future of community generally then, Marilyn? I mean, one of the reasons that I'm talking to you is because you'll hate me saying this, but you are the godmother of the SAP community network, whether you like it or not. Everybody who knows you knows you in that way. And whenever there's a major problem, the question always comes up: what would Marilyn do? So we're now in this new environment, and what does it mean for community? I think it's an enormous opportunity to reboot.
Opportunity.
Massive opportunity to reboot. That's my view.
No, I think that it's also a massive opportunity for equal access. It's a great opportunity for. Again, I'm a little loath to use these bombastic words, but for a democratization of systems. And I see that as an incredible education opportunity. I see that as a workplace opportunity. And, you know, we always discussed, and you and I have had opportunities to engage in grassroots projects, in bottom-up projects. And we know how to assemble our people who are like-minded. I think the trick now is, and you've done a great job of this, Den, of bringing in the elements that can make things happen. So they're the makers and the doers, and they're the thinkers and they're the creators. It's getting that whole set of folks assembled. And sometimes it just falls into place. You know, I was thinking about the ESME project too, right?
And blimey, that, yeah. Oh, yeah.
They, you know, a social experiment in social messaging.
It was.
And it was before its time. But, you know, it's ironic that we brought that up now, because now is the time. And I think that's the now is the time theme. How did you started speaking about that now? You know, it's not the future of work.
Yeah, it's the now of work, right? And I hear you very clearly here, Marilyn, but there's a problem with this, and at least from my perspective, and that is if you wind the clock back to those days when the community really was thriving very well within that company, when ESME was possible, when things like the Certification 5 was possible, and other similar initiatives was possible, there was a very, very different environment at that point in time. And a number of those people have developed, they've moved on, which is understandable. People do move on in their lives, and you have to respect that. But what I see as a problem, I haven't seen, or at least if they're around, I don't know where they are, the people who would follow on, okay? So, you know, people like yourself, perhaps myself in my own way, could mentor others, but where are they? Where are the people who are going to come forward and create around this particular set of things that you're talking about? That's my concern at the moment. I don't know if you see the same or not, but you know, I can put it very simply. Recently, I met with Christian Klein, who's co-CEO of SAP, right? And he asked me a whole ton of questions about things that, you know, he said, well, what would you do here? What would you do there? And it's quite a long list. And as he was going through it, I had some answers, a few, but I said, oh, you need to talk to this person, that person. There was a whole bunch of people that I felt that he would benefit from talking to. None of them are people that I've met in the last 5 years. They're all people that I've known for the last 10, 15 years, because I haven't met people in the last 5, 10 years who have demonstrated that same sense of community as those that I'm thinking about. Now, I'm not trying to be elitist in any way, shape, or form. I really wish it wasn't that way, because I need to learn, right? And you only learn so much from your peers before you need fresh ideas coming in, right? And you need new people. You need people that you've never met before, and all the rest of it. I'm just not seeing it, or at least maybe I've missed it. I don't know, but that my concern is that there hasn't been enough of that to come forward in the last 5, 10 years now, and that seems to be true elsewhere, I have to say. You know, I've seen leaders in other large communities, and they've done absolutely amazing job, disappeared, but who came and replaced them, right? Where was that new fresh blood? I don't know where they are. And even while this is a phenomenal opportunity, it would be such a shame if those newer faces, they've got to be around. I don't know where they are. They've got to be around. We're not allowed to flourish and come forward. That's my concern at the moment. Have I missed something? Have I just been stuck in a hole somewhere and just missed it all? Or what do you think?
I'm thinking that there, again, opportunity. Maybe it's approach too. I always seek out what I call reverse mentoring. So I'm always looking to see how we can create those resources. My most recent experience with Doctors Without Borders was such a case. Totally inspired by a young man who I was hired to train. I was hired to mentor, to lead the logistics online community that Doctors Without Borders was creating for its logisticians in the field. I digress for a moment, but for me,
no. Do talk about that, because you know, I don't know this story, and I'm sure others would love to hear it.
so it's not a corporate experience, but there's certainly a lot of parallels. Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, is arguably a well-respected and very productive system of humanitarian care delivery.
Sure.
And it is divided into the doctors, the caregivers that we all know about, and the logisticians that support them, right? There's a lot of logistics in the field. And there is a kind of command and control in a way, because there are organizational structures around the world, headquarters, that are orchestrating the field operations on the ground. And when I was called in to help build this community of practice for logisticians to have some knowledge exchange, I suggested, and it was readily accepted, that in order to understand the workings of this organization, I need to be proximate. So I was sent to Haiti and then Malawi, and it was incredibly inspiring. When you talk
get
about
all the great places, what is it? You need to be proximate. Yeah, where are you going to go? Haiti? Yeah, I could do that. Malawi? Yeah, I could do that.
Well, it wasn't like that. I had a lot of concerns. The concerns
sure.
actually weren't at all about personal safety or cool places. It was more about being a distraction in places where people were really doing the work. And in fact, in Haiti, at that point in time, I didn't have a French-speaking background, so I needed a translator, and that meant a filtering of information, and interviewing. Since that time, I've gone on to Duolingo. In the last 2 years, I can say that I have some reasonable understanding now of French.
You speak French. Good.
I don't say I speak. I say I listen. And in Malawi, they had people would converse with me in English. But what I wanted to say was, what was inspiring was to see the local people with incredible ingenuity and a lot of passion interact with the non-local resources, or they could call them the non-national resources, that were deployed to assist and aid and sometimes guide. And it was I saw some very interesting interactions that really made me understand that if you are truly able to listen to the people who have the local knowledge, you can make tremendous impact and difference in the way an organization functions. So going back to this idea of mentorship, I saw a tremendous passion for mentoring leadership, for being able to helicopter in, provide services, but the idea was to create a functioning organism when you left. And to leave it in the hands of the local people, not to be absolutely imposing on them a set of ways of behaving, but rather taking from the local knowledge and building something that would be sustainable. And in the same way, going back to the reverse mentoring of the young man who is the community manager of this logistician online community, I learned a lot from him as well, although I think that my role was to mentor. So he also took example and went and was proximate. I believe that he went to the Middle East. Probably went to some places where, as a former kibbutznik, I would not be welcome. But what I'm trying to say is, we collaborated. He came back. We discussed some of these experiences. We tapped some of those local talents that we discovered or uncovered during our missions of interview, observe, be proximate. And I believe that when I left that consulting gig, I left at least the germ of a functioning and to me inspiring concept of a community. The thing that kills it, the thing that squashes it, is command and control, and there's risk there, right? Because even in an organization as wonderful as Doctors Without Borders, you know. So I am optimistic. I think it's being mindful of the need to listen to the people, really. And sometimes it's, you know, there's no choice. Doctors Without Borders, I'm sure, does not have the human resources to continue to support all of these crisis management needs all over the world, and has to create a situation, a change management. And I think that they're in the process of doing that, and witnessing that is actually very inspiring. I think I might have told a story, and if I didn't, I'll share it because it's a wonderful one in Malawi, of how I saw high-tech epidemiological data mapping, and what it was this wonderful community leader interviewing local residents and having them draw in the sand their maps of their churches, their schools, the places where they had supplies, their villages. He translated it into high-tech paper, and then that became digital. And then I also met with some local young people that were involved in GIS and were really starting to geomap things. Similar story in Haiti with malaria education. What they did there was amazing. They went into neighborhoods, they enlisted gang members to go door to door and start bringing education to the people. They did that pictorially. They made murals on walls. So, I mean, we don't need digital tools to do all of these things entirely. But it's having that trust in local people, and in mentoring, in partnering, and in reverse mentoring, and learning from those people as well.
NGOs, at least in my experience, are just as, if not more, quote unquote, political than corporations. And sometimes that can be, can almost be strangling in terms of getting things done. So if it can work in those organizations, I tend to think if it can work in those situations, then it can work anywhere, right? But what I think I've heard you say is that regardless of what you're doing, you have to be able to meet people where they're at. Yeah? The technology can follow without a shadow of a doubt, but, you know, talking about drawing in the sand, maybe that's because they haven't got paper and pencil, right? And that's the way for them to be able to understand things. You know, going out to gang members and doing murals, well, you know, maybe that's the way that you need to talk to these people. So perhaps the thing that I'm taking from this more than anything is, if I meet people where they're at, I've probably got a reasonable chance of having some success. If I try and impose them on them the way I think it should be done in my worldview, not going to happen. And maybe that has to be something of the blueprint of however we go forward with this in the future. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that, yeah, bingo. I think that's been my learning even in these few brief weeks, trying to imagine how I could best support, you know, at a small scale, some of the instructors, my own grandchildren, for goodness sakes, you know, who are learning. Hearing what their preferences are, how they work, observing. And it does take a little bit of time. The thing is, where most of us are who are doers or are fixers or empaths are ready to jump in and, and make it better and fix it. And I think that getting a sense of what people need and also what people can tolerate right now is going to be our challenge for those people who want to make things better.
Okay. What's next for you then, Marilyn? Other than probably a cup of tea or coffee or whatever it is, or it's not wine o'clock yet over your way. I know that.
No, it's not. Walking the beach, actually, and maybe that relates to. Luckily enough, it's cold here, very, very cold. Yesterday it was freezing cold, and the beach was totally empty. And it's, as I said, just a couple of meters from my doorstep. And in walking the beach, bundled up, I observed the only other inhabitants that were on the beach, and they were birds of all different sorts. And I was watching their different methods of feeding themselves. And it made me think a lot about different, ways that people either cooperate, interact. So I had an amazing experience. I saw these northern gannets that are divers from 100 feet at least down to about 100 feet or maybe more into the water, straight dive to capture their food. But they work cooperatively. Wherever you see those northern gannets, if you're fortunate enough to see them way out in the horizon, you'll also see schools of dolphin, whales, seals. They drive the fish up, the birds jump down. So there's those kind of feeders, if you will. And on the shoreline, I saw the oyster catchers, and they're equipped with two different types of bills. They have these orange beaks that they're able to pry oysters open, or they're also able to drill down into the sand. But they only have those two methods of operation. That's it. They're limited, and they work in pairs. There's two of them, squawking and hunting and feeding. Unlike them, they're the seagulls, and they're kind of opportunistic omnivores. They're going to eat anything that they find on the beach. They're going to scare other creatures away. They squawk a lot. They work solo, and they were driving a whole flock, little tiny sandpipers, and they seem to work very, very well in huge groups, running all over the place, very, very fast. They're really entertaining to watch. And what does this all have to do with thoughts about community? I was just thinking about all the different types of food gatherers there are, and how in this natural order, each has a very, very different way of functioning, of learning, of eating, of sustaining themselves. And it made me think that, there are all kinds of learners, there are all kinds of workers, and we're going to have to find a way of accommodating all those different styles of being. So maybe I'll go back out to the beach and start observing some more.
Fantastic. I'm glad you're optimistic. We need people who are optimistic at this point in time, don't we?
But I think we actually also need infrastructures and systems that are willing to support. As I said, I was really happy to see just a few minutes before the call that Google is providing both money and resources to learning platforms. If I have anything that I'd like to focus on right now, it's remote learning or distance learning. While I was at SAP, we translated our work from classroom work to remote learning, and I was a part of that transition, and it wasn't easy. But I'd like to see how I can somehow support those kind of transitions and make those work in organizations that can scale. And if it's reverse mentoring, so be it. I bet those organizations have incredible resources, and I know they do.
Note to the audience: hire the lady.
not about hiring, it's about cooperation and collaboration.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Marilyn. That's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you too, and be well.